So we have microservices and web applications in module 4. So what are microservices? Microservices are a software development technique, a variant of the service-oriented architecture style that arranges an application as a collection of loosely coupled services. So in a microservices services architecture, services are fine-grained and the protocols are lightweight. So before microservices were introduced, we used to have monolithic architecture. So if a user or a mobile user or a web app user, he's trying to access a database or he's trying to access a web application, so that the request goes through a lot of interconnected applications. So they are dependent on each other in serving that request. So if something fails in that architecture, in that web application, which are integrated with each other tightly, the whole application will be down and the request might not be processed. So this is kind of a like monolithic architecture. So where everything is tightly coupled and dependent on each other. If something fails, the whole web application will break down. So to mitigate this problem, microservices were introduced where each service is loosely coupled. So they are independent of each other, and if something fails, that part only will be failed. Rest other will be keep on working together. So this will not affect the request of user. So and they will get served every time. So when we were discussing about microservices architecture, so one more thing that from security perspective is very important to discuss is Amazon API gateway. So when someone requests for a service or any usage, so he will hit the URL. So if the URL is exposed directly, it is prone to attacks like DDoS or SQL injection or some any kind of like hacking techniques. So to counter that, to reduce that, uh, there is something called API gateway which has been introduced. So the API gateway will be the front end, will be the front face of your web applications. So whatever the request call, REST API call or SOAP API call that will come or WebSocket call, that will first hit the Amazon API gateway. So the API gateway can work as a load balancer, it can work as a filter, it can work as a security firewall for your web application. So it can serve a lot of purposes. So instead of directly sending the request to your Lambda function or your EC2 instances or anywhere, it's always preferable to use Amazon API gateway for security purposes. So if you see the API call flow of the Amazon web application, so you see like from mobile application websites or any other services, the request is coming to CloudFront. So this is how API gateway works. When you configure the API gateway, you'll get multiple options. So one of them will be from where you want to get the request. So usually you can select CloudFront. So whatever the request that will come to the edge location of the CloudFront, and then it will be transferred to API gateway. So from API gateway, it can trigger Lambda function or whatever some services from EC2 instances or any other services you can utilize from that particular point. So here API gateway can work as a load balancer or redirector of service, and it will act upon how the request has been done. Now, what defines the API? So in API, we can have at least the basic three things that should be in the API. Is a resource that contains the order ID or something, which we'll discuss in the upcoming web application demo. and then the method, like what you want with that API. Are you trying to fetch something, or you want to post something or put something, etc. So this method can be defined when we'll create the API. And then like what is the backend integration? Like where is the API call going? So is it triggering a Lambda function, or it is triggering some other service? So basically in this demo, we'll be using this to trigger the Lambda function to perform some activities. Now here is the web application architecture that we are going to implement. So we'll be having a web browser which will hold the web app, and when some user he tries to um, request a ride from that web application, it will fetch the um, it will get authenticated. The user need to be present in Cognito user pool. It will be authenticated from Cognito user pool, and then once he is authenticated, he will make a dynamic API calls with Amazon API Gateway, which will trigger the Lambda function, and the Lambda function in response will make an entry in the DynamoDB and will register the request of the user and will serve it later. So this is how it works. Here in S3 we'll be keeping the HTML and CSS files, which are like web application files, that will be kept in Amazon S3. So this is the basic serverless web application architecture we'll be going to implement in the demo section.